Hi, Grace.
Hi.
Thank you for accepting my interview
Oh,
invitation.
thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, so today we will talk about your book, Tastes Like War. The book's Chinese translation, Chinese version was recently published in China. And so I got this book from the Chinese publisher, and reading this book was an emotionally intense journey for me. I read it overnight. I didn't sleep at all.
Oh,
Yeah. And yeah, I cried in the middle of it several times. And I mean, it's not only the emotional power, I mean, it also allowed me to understand a significant part of the history of South Korean women in the 20th century, which I never knew before, both in their homeland and in the United States.
mhm,
So, and it also drew parallels to the experiences of Chinese women.
mhm,
And there are some histories, I mean, quite similar there.
right.
And they are also underexplored and inadequately narrated. So,
Mhm,
thank you very much for your amazing work. And I believe many readers have shared or will share this intense emotional journey when they read your book, and they will be much more aware of this part of the history. And you mentioned that your ability to convey such genuine and powerful emotions stems from using Patricia Clove's method of
mhm,
autoethnography. And this approach involves the ethnographer positioning themselves as both the subject and object of the observation,
yeah.
which is also very refreshing to me. And they explore the experiences from within their own lives.
Mhm,
And some scholars have questioned or dismissed this personalized and over-emotional nature of your research, but you have to refuse to conform to the
mhm,
so-called objective standards of social sciences, rejecting the idea of censoring your emotions. I personally agree that the patriarchal and colonial academic traditions have
yeah.
obvious limitations when it comes to so-called objectivity, because our emotions are also important facts to be presented and recorded and considered.
Mhm,
So your book is a powerful demonstration of that. And what I like especially that you wrote that my curiosity is driven by anger, sadness, and a sense of betrayal, and I view emotional discomfort as my intellectual guide.
yeah.
I appreciate that very much, and I would like to borrow from your method to guide our conversation today. Let's
Great.
open each topic by exploring the origins of these emotions in your
Yeah.
book.
Mhm,
Okay, so let's start by discussing loneliness and fear. I mean, loneliness and fear is the kind of emotion that women in patriarchal societies experience almost every day. And your mother, Kunya, was born in 1941 in Osaka, Japan, at a time when Korean Peninsula was under Japanese colonial rule. When World War II ended, she returned with her parents to South Korea, now under American military administration. Due to poverty, she was unable to receive an education and had to start working on American military bases as a young adult, possibly engaging in sex work.
mhm,
And this part is denied by some of your family members,
mhm,
you know, and
right.
that's a big controversy. But of course, it's undeniable that many South Korean women did serve in the American military base as exploited sex workers. And many families in South Korea at the time was impoverished and threatened by the Korean War and poverty brought the fear of survival. And Korean women providing sex services to the American soldiers faces additional fears and loneliness compared to their male family members. And so, could you talk about the political and social cultural factors that created such fear and loneliness for these women?
Yeah,
Yeah,
so I want to actually start by saying a little bit about
mm,
Japanese imperialism.
yeah,
Um,
thank you. Yeah.
because the system of organized sex work for US troops is actually rooted in the system of sexual slavery for the Japanese Imperial Army, the
Mm,
so-called comfort stations, right, that were
mm,
established throughout the Japanese Empire in Asia. And so there is sort of this, this mythical narrative that the US liberated Korea from Japan. But in fact, when the occupation government arrived in the southern part of the peninsula in 1945, they relied on the infrastructure and the personnel that the Japanese had set up, including transferring some of those military brothels. And so we even see now, it is coming out just in the last few years, the language in the archival research about the US occupation, that they continue to use the word comfort woman, referring to women who were conscripted to serve the sexual and emotional needs of American personnel.
Wow.
Right. And so while, there is this narrative that the US liberated Korea, in many ways, it actually just continued these brutal and exploitative conditions that the Japanese had created. And, the division of the peninsula was not supposed to be permanent. And it was one of the major factors that sparked the Korean War. And, again, there's this narrative in the US that the war was about one thing only, about fighting international communism. But ultimately, it was it started as a civil war over the reunification of the peninsula and the terms under which that would happen. And so this war was absolutely devastating for civilians. 10% of the civilian population was killed throughout the peninsula. Wow. In North Korea, it was 20%. And even American military officials went on record to say that they had bombed every city and town to ruins in the entire peninsula. So, at the end of this completely devastating war, you have the survivors. So you have, they were mostly people like my mother and my grandmother, right? Women who had lost the men in their family and were suddenly forced to make a living in the aftermath of this destruction. And so, I only learned some of the details about my family's trajectory immediately after the war recently from a family member in Korea, who knew my mother in Korea. And he found Tastes Like War after it was published in Korean. And so I reconnected with him, and he's volunteered some of his own memories and stories that I'm now sort of incorporating into my knowledge of my family. And so what he told me was that my mother was 13 at the time that they moved from their small town in the countryside to Busan, to the city. First, she worked in a factory and did a lot of odd jobs all over the city. And then a few years later, she started working in the nightclubs around the US military bases because the pay was higher there. And he was only a few years younger than my mom, so he remembers a lot of this, and he sort of measured it based on how old he was at the time. He said he was in 4th grade when they moved to Busan. He was in high school. He was just starting high school when she started working in the nightclub, so which would have made her probably about 18 at that time. And then a couple of years later, he said that not only did she work in those nightclubs in Busan, that she had to travel around the region to other nightclubs to follow the work, to follow the demand of the American soldiers.
Wow.
And so this detail, actually the one that I learned most recently, after writing Tastes Like War, is the one that really impressed upon me, her fear and loneliness, probably more than any other detail. Because, not only was the work dangerous and demeaning, she had to leave home and live without her family for the first time at this young age, which I, estimate based on what he told me, maybe around the age of 20. And I think of myself at that age and my daughter at that age, right? And how different and privileged our lives were in comparison.
Yeah.
So, we were living in this safe and comfortable environment of college, getting an education, while my mother was supporting her family by providing, quote unquote, comfort to American soldiers.
Yeah, I find that word particularly ironic.
Yeah, it's so it's very disturbing when you think about it, right? And just to think about the political context of the war. Yeah. Again, I think about who the winners and losers of war are, and it's the civilians are always the losers. But within that, there's a hierarchy. So women like my mom were near the bottom of that hierarchy. because they were mistreated by the South Korean government, who profited off of their labor, but treated them and their children as outcasts.
Yeah.
And then if we think about whether or not there are any winners of the Korean War, the US was a winner. I mean, there was no military victory, but the Korean War was the justification for a massive investment in future militarization, which then led to a US military empire and now a permanent presence in Korea. And so, there's no incentive from a US perspective to bring a formal end to the war, because South Korea is such a good strategic location for the US. And then, you asked about why her loneliness and fear continued into her life in America. So she was seen by a foreigner, as a foreigner by locals. And among the few Korean people she met, they assumed that she was a prostitute, because if you were a Korean woman with an American man or with biracial children, that was always the assumption in those days.
There's a term for that, right? There is a derogative term, Korean term for women like
Yanggongju. Yeah, Yanggongju, which literally means Western princess, right? But it is a derogatory term, and then you also have to consider the immigration experience. If you move to a place where the culture, the language, the food are completely different, that is quite an isolating experience. And so there again is the loneliness and the fear, but I also want to remember that she was not just lonely and afraid, because she was also really brave to have been able to survive the way she did.
Yeah. I mean, the loneliness and fear, I mean, also somehow was partly inherited by you, subconsciously or consciously. I mean, in your book, you describe your childhood as a second-generation immigrant. I mean, even though you are sort of mixed kid, and you describe that your, how would you call it, hometown is a conservative and xenophobic white town in America. But I mean, this is disputed by your brother, right? But he didn't remember that history in such a way. Why is it, you think? Why is it that your memory and your brother's differ so much when it comes to that? Yeah.
Well, I think some of it is about gender.
Yeah,
because I think that my brother he was able to enjoy some privileges that I didn't necessarily as a girl. So I think that's part of it, but I think it was also that I can't really speak that much about the psychology of my brother, but he was older than me. He had a different experience in Korea. Like he went to school there and, sort of remembers what it was like to be a biracial child there. So I think he really wanted to believe in America in a way that I never did,
Also makes sense.
Yes. Yeah. And so I think he wanted to he was invested in the rescue narrative, that this was the country that was going to give him opportunities when South Korea couldn't do that. Yeah. And, I think for myself, that some elements of that are true, but I think I was just very aware of my otherness and alienation in that town. And I think because I felt very close to my mother as a child and just sort of followed her around everywhere, I observed the way she was treated differently than my father was when I was with my father. And I absorbed a lot of her loneliness, perhaps in a way that my brother didn't necessarily.
I could see. I mean, the gender perspective and the background say a lot. But I mean, this kind of loneliness of the ethnic Asian or minorities in the US in the past decade has somehow, I don't know whether it's come back or actually has always been there, but it's sort of enlarged in the past decade, that you witnessed the rapid spread of this conservatism and xenophobia, especially during and after Trump's rise to power. It even took hold of the center of Americans' political stage. I believe many readers, like myself, only became aware of the historical context and probably the emotional context behind the 2021 Atlanta spa shooting after reading the book. In this tragedy, a white man killed 9 strangers, most of whom were Korean and Chinese female massagers. Do you think the situation for Asian American immigrants today has not improved compared to Kunya's experiences in the 1970s?
Well, I think that it's a complicated answer because it's, things both have and haven't improved since the 1970s. In some ways they definitely have. Like we've seen some significant changes in areas of representation, for example, where you see more Asian American people in entertainment, more Asian American writers and academics being published. And so more generally, the public sort of knows a variety of different experiences of Asian American people because we've gained some visibility, I would say, especially in the last 10 years. And I think some of that is a result of the coming of age of the children of immigrants, of an earlier generation of immigrants. But it's also part of this broader movement in the US to address issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're linked to and indebted to other movements for racial justice. And, there have been real efforts to recognize how white privilege works, and especially at the structural level. But so I think this is where it gets complicated, is that whenever there is a change, there's also backlash. And so then we've seen this huge conservative backlash in the US. And so, just as this conversation about race has started to change in a meaningful way, we're also seeing laws that are passed in several states to ban critical race studies, sometimes even naming specific books and authors as prohibited. So there's, this kind of censorship, legal censorship that is somewhat, unusual. And then just as things are starting to change for LGBTQ communities, we're seeing all these anti-trans laws, a surge of anti-trans and anti-queer violence. And, as far as the situation for Asian Americans goes, we have historically been invisible. And I think part of that is from the model minority myth, and it says, look at how well Asian Americans do in school, and, look at how successful they are. It just pits us against other groups that should be our allies, but it also obscures the violence and discrimination that Asian American people experience. And it has contributed to a persistent denial of our experiences. So, you mentioned Atlanta, and the officers who responded to the Atlanta spa shooting said that it was not racially motivated, that it was related instead to the shooter's sexual fantasies. And so what that tells me is that the sexualization of Asian women is not even recognizable as racial violence to white people who are in power, right? So, but if anybody who goes through the world in the body of an Asian American woman knows that our race makes us more vulnerable to sexual violence and harassment. And, that's where you can link today's experience back to my mother's generation, the experience of women like her who were expected to serve American men in the military, right? So that's one of the structural elements of the stereotype that Asian women are prostitutes. But it's a stereotype that was created by this reality of the US military empire in Asia.
I mean, we all know that from porn websites, normally in the survey, Asian women rank the top, which is not actually, it's not a compliment.
No, not at all.
It's actually very dangerous if you are seen as the object of sex for males. I mean, coming to that, of course, then there is a very important topic about shame, about this emotion, which is, shame is a foremost burdensome emotions that women feel in a patriarchal society ever since patriarchy came to power. So in the preface of the book, you mentioned Professor Bell Hooks' theory as liberatory practice.
Mm-hmm.
It helped you to realize that shame itself is a political tool used to silence the oppressed.
Yeah.
And I think it was in 2013, 12, I also wrote an article about shame that very interestingly that we all notice that how much women are burdened by shame.
Yeah.
That should not be there. You wrote about that the approximately like 100,000 Korean women who provided sex services to American soldiers. These women, despite supporting their Korean families with their bodies in labor and even bringing their families to live in the United States, they were regarded as shameful family secrets by the Korean community. I think many women from different ethnicity can relate to that.
Mm-hmm.
Their shame even casted a shadow on the hundreds of thousands of Korean women who married American men and moved to the United States. I have observed that using such shame to control and oppress women is a universal tool since I was very young, I think.
Yeah.
And countless women endure the same absurd shame. And your book, I think, is an open fight against this oppressive shame and has costed you dearly.
Yeah.
I mean, in the book, you describe how you and your mother reached an agreement for you to tell her story. But it has angered your family and relatives so much that it led to some cutting of family ties. And I believe this was an incredibly difficult process. And I'm very interested in knowing how you, first of all, cope with the shame that you must have felt, and then how did you cope with the cost of this resistance?
So when I was a week before my 23rd birthday, when one of the family members who now denies that my mother had been a sex worker, that person told me the family secret that my mom had been a sex worker. And the feelings that brought up in me were so overwhelming. The overwhelming feeling was shame. And I then had to really examine where that was coming from, because I think it's something that we often take for granted, that sex work is something shameful. And so when it was something that was so close to me, to really a part of my origin story, that became an opportunity to study it. But even though shame was the dominant feeling, another one that was really powerful was confusion. And so that confusion then turned into curiosity. And so it was the need to know and understand my family history that eventually overpowered the shame. And at some point, I didn't even feel like I had a choice in the matter to go, I had to continue to study this once I'd started. Like in the memoir, I sort of describe it as flipping on a switch. And so like once the switch is on and the things come into the light, there's no going back, because you now see things that were hidden before. And in my first book, I had written about this really vivid dream that I had, that I later realized was about the conflict within my family over my work. And it was a dream in which I was walking through this empty space towards my childhood home, and there was a Korean man in a car who came up to me and told me, "Do not go back to the place where you were born," in a very menacing way. But I did it anyway. I go back to my family home, and I'm looking for my mother, and I start to open a door, and I feel this incredible fear as I'm opening it, but I can't stop myself because I have to know what's on the other side. And so then I realized in that dream that person who was telling me not to go back is the person in my family who was saying, "Don't do this work." But what I realized also from that dream was that my curiosity was stronger than my fear. And so I continued with the work. I knew that my writing was going to create distance between me and some of my other family members, but we had already been growing apart the older I got. You know, the more I developed my own perspective of the world, which was actually very different from theirs. And, you know, ideally, I wanted to reconcile those differences, but we were not able to. And that made me really sad. But I had to think about my priorities and about what kind of a person I aspired to be, you know. So, and I'm going to be very honest that my work started from a selfish motivation. It was about understanding my own trauma. It wasn't about anything bigger. But the more the more I went forward with my work, the more I realized that there were a lot of other people who identified with it or supported it. And the most important among them was my mother, because if she had told me that she didn't want me to publish my writing, I would have honored that wish. And the reason I would have done so for her and not for these other family members was because I had a really close relationship with my mom and I valued the relationship. But coming from a family member I didn't feel any love from, you know, who never tried to see my point of view, who never tried to have a real dialogue about my concerns, it just felt like they were trying to bully me into silence because they were uncomfortable with my words. And that was not the kind of person I aspired to be. It's just, I didn't want to be someone who would give in to something like that. And the fact that my mom not only consented to the publication of my first book, but was actually excited to see it in print. It just made everything that I lost in the process worth it. And, you know, since I've come out as a public person about my family history, I've had a lot of strangers who reached out to me to tell me that they feel connected to or represented by my work. And so that's how I've coped with it. And it has allowed me to have a kind of resolution to that conflict, even if the resolution is not between me and the other family members. It is an internal solution that I found.
Have you shown, I mean, I know that your book was published after your mom passed away, and have you ever, during the process of writing the book, shown her some of the parts you have written?
Have I shown it? Did I show it to her? Or
show to her? Yeah, to your mom. Yeah.
No, I only started writing it after she died. Tastes Like War after she died. But with my first book, I did.
Your first book. Yeah.
Right. With my first book, I talked to her about the book, and I was going to show her parts of it, but then she passed away suddenly. But yeah, so it's like, as I wrote in the memoir, I gotten the cover design and I was excited to show it to her, and then she died 2 days later. But you know, in the weeks leading up to her death, every time I saw her, she would pull a book out of my book bag and say, "Is this your book?" You know, with a lot of excitement, like looking forward to seeing the book.
And I completely find it absurd that whatever discussion about this fact, what lay the emotion lay behind it is that if my mom was a sex worker, due to poverty and systematic oppression, I should feel ashamed for her. What kind of feeling is that? I mean, this is very, very. I mean, there's no justice in it if you think about this, right? And so the sort of, I would find this shame rather absurd, because it's actually from a sort of power unbalance between men and women. I mean, the ones who should feel ashamed are those men who purchase sex from exploited women. Perhaps we can discuss about some similarly paradoxical and sensitive issues in the current Western context, because I live in Germany, and we also have the same discussion here for many years. Whether the legalization and destigmatization of the sex industry is the path to women's liberation. And we know that in Scandinavian countries, they have a Scandinavian model, which is to
decriminalize?
They decriminalize the selling of sex, but they criminalize purchase of sex, because that is obviously against humanitarian rule. But Scandinavian model is not adopted in Germany. And there were lots of debates about that because, of course, there were those who are willing to sell sex to purchasers, buyers. They would argue this is the freedom. And you also mentioned somewhere, I remember that while some predominantly white women, some fight for the freedom to sell sex, many women of color are still fighting for the freedom not to be forced into selling their body. So how do you see the consequences of destigmatizing and legalizing the sex industry?
Well, I actually want to, point out that the system of sex work that my mother worked in was actually completely legal. So legalization is not the answer. I think legalization actually allows government regulation, and so it was highly regulated by the South Korean government, and U.S. military officials had a pretty heavy hand in monitoring it as well. So in the situation that my mom was in, it was precisely the legality that allowed officials to control women's bodies. So I'm not an advocate of legalizing sex work, although I think that decriminalization is an important step, and destigmatization also I think is one ingredient towards women's liberation. I don't think it is the path, but as we talked about shame being a weapon that's used against women, I think destigmatizing sex work and women's sexuality more broadly can help us gain autonomy and freedom over our bodies and what we choose to do with them. But it is just one ingredient, and I want to think about the question of bodily autonomy going beyond sex work to include other kinds of labor, because I think about what about the woman who has to subject herself to factory work under inhumane or unsafe conditions? Or what about the agricultural worker who does this backbreaking work to put food in our mouths for sub-minimum wage? Or what about the wife who gives up her aspirations to do invisible domestic labor that allows her husband to thrive in his career?
I mean that there is a difference between these and sex work, which is that sex work predominantly provided by women is also heavily loaded with shame.
Yes.
And that shame could end up being like, if I work as a slave worker in a factory, I would not be shamed when I change my profession. But if I were once a sex worker, then I would probably be excluded from the society's any other work.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that it is a far more stigmatized form of labor. But, I know that some sex worker advocates or activists will say that we need to start thinking about it within the continuum of women's labor, because even setting it apart and saying this is an exceptional type of work, in a way contributes to the stigmatization. So I think that's sort of what I
that's okay. That's complicated.
So can we do both things at once? Can we both look at it in this continuum of how to think about women's freedom and bodily autonomy within a larger, the larger umbrella of dehumanizing work conditions? And can we destigmatize the sexuality of the work? Go ahead.
It is very hard, and I have to admit, it's a very, very complicated topic that I raised.
Yeah, and I wanted to just say one more thing about the point that you mentioned from my book. I was referencing the words of the late Adul de Leon, who was a sex worker activist and AIDS activist from the Philippines, about Western feminists fighting over the choice to be a prostitute, and she points out that there is this inherent privilege in the debate itself, because the question of whether or not one chooses to be a sex worker only makes sense when your survival is not at stake, right? And so we have, like that debate doesn't always make sense in conditions where, for example, in post-war Korea, where there's bare survival, bare minimum survival is sort of the thing that drives you towards the work.
And then we will come to the next stage, which is questioning and anger. We just spoke about the courage needed to somehow shatter the shackles of shame. I believe this courage often begins with questioning the status quo and feeling one's anger. But such questioning and anger also come at a cost. You mentioned having 3 mothers in consequences, and that's actually questioning and anger. The first mother was the active, charismatic, family-oriented, hardworking, and entrepreneurial Konya. She strived to assimilate into American white society, but despite her intelligence and diligence, she gradually realized that she would never be really accepted as one of them. So meanwhile, but on the other hand, as a young Gongzhu, she was scorned by Korean society as well and excluded in a certain way. So she had no welcoming homeland to return to. So gradually the first mother collapsed and the second mother emerged. And she began to question the world and lost trust in it. And she became we don't know what's the reason, whether this is the consequence of it, that she became schizophrenic. Mm-hmm. You later discovered that, very important discovery, that schizophrenia has social causes. But at the time when she got it, it was thought to be merely a genetic defect. So could you tell us that the social conditions contribute to the development of schizophrenia and why it is more prevalent among minority groups in the United States?
Yeah,
maybe in other societies, I don't know. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I always thought that it was more than just genetic, even when I was a 15-year-old girl first observing the changes in my mom. I knew that it couldn't have just been that, because I knew she had experienced a lot of trauma, but I didn't exactly know what it was. And you know, and then in 2016, a book called Our Most Troubling Madness, Case Studies in Schizophrenia Across Cultures was published, that talked about 6 social risk factors for schizophrenia. And it was looking at a number of studies that had been done since the 1970s, where they're finding the same things over and over again. So that researchers are now pretty confident in saying these are the social risk factors for schizophrenia. It is not just genetic. There's an interplay between our genes and the social factors. And I looked at this list and I realized that 5 out of the 6 risk factors applied to my mom, and some of them were things that I sort of had an intuitive sense about, such as poverty during childhood, sexual trauma, other types of childhood adversity. But then there were two things on the list that were surprising to me when I first read this book. Surprising only in the sense that I hadn't read this in the literature before, but in an intuitive way, it made sense. And one of those was immigration, that people who have had the experience of immigration are more likely to have what Western psychiatry calls schizophrenia. And the other is being a person of color in a white neighborhood. And that is linked to something called ethnic density. So that the more white the neighborhood is, or the fewer of your kind there are in the neighborhood, the higher the risk is of developing schizophrenia. And those studies actually don't really tell us why that's the case. They just show us that it is the case, right? So that's an area that needs to be explored more. But my feeling about it is that some of it comes from the everyday stress of racism, that after decades of experiencing this, it sort of wears away at your resilience and your ability to cope with everyday life. But I think the other is that the mental health care system, which is increasingly being exported around the world, is based on this medical model that still sees schizophrenia and mental illness more generally as biological disease, like any other disease, right? And that it is not culturally relevant for a lot of people. It sort of reduces treatment to 2 things. One is medication, just drugs, as if there's nothing more to explore. But in the US in particular, we have a mental health care system that doesn't actually care for people, but just locks them up or segregates them. And here it is, especially if you are poor or a person of color with a mental illness, it's much more likely that you will encounter the police than you will encounter a therapist. And currently the biggest, what are called mental health care providers in the US, the three biggest are jails, and so that's a scenario in which the only quote unquote mental health care treatment is a drug prescription. And so that has come to displace anything that looks like actual care. And so it's a lot of different factors, and it's sort of a complicated answer to that question in an area where there needs to be a lot more research.
Yeah, I absolutely believe this is an under-researched topic in every country, in every patriarchal society, I would say. Because, in China, I saw exactly the parallel. When observing the second phase of Kunal's life, I see a parallel with my own mother's experience. My mother was also a very intelligent and diligent woman with high self-esteem and self-expectations. And then, although she did not face racial discrimination, she belonged to a disadvantaged social class due to her family background in the 1960s and 1970s. In China, in the revolutionary China. And so she encountered lots of violence as well, and discrimination as a young girl. And so consequently, also because of this discrimination, despite her excellent high school performance, she was excluded from university. And later she fell back, of course, after China enter another, opening reform stage. And then she got her college degree, but then she had to fight with blatant gender discrimination in marriage and work. So she also questioned a lot. She fought back very hard and expressed her intense anger. But that came at a huge cost, because when women express their anger in questioning, eventually people around her would say she had mental problems. So in the latter half of her life, she did become even more increasingly anxious and often immersed in painful memories, and she cannot control herself, telling miserable stories from her life and the unjust she encountered. I knew she wasn't ill. I knew it was trauma, and she had all the reason to expect that. Actually, what's wrong? The sick one was the society. But I couldn't quite, do a sort of research on that, because I'm not a sociologist. You have shown an example, a very good example, recording the hallucinations and delusions of the second Kunya and probing their specific causes. For example, why would truth talk to her? I find that fascinating. Like, whose voices were they materializing? So you were the only one in the family who tried to deeply understand her and questioning and anger. And so because of your effort to understand and connect with her, the third mother was able to emerge. And then I saw how when Me Too burst out, like the Me Too happened 6 to 7 years ago, it was actually, you could see many women were doing the same thing secretly. Although some of them, most of them were not got this mental illness diagnosis from the hospital, but I guess people were thinking that they were mentally ill. I don't know whether Me Too movement have changed that somehow, have allowed the society to pay more attention to women's anger and questioning without defining them as being mad. How do you see the legacy of Me Too movement so far with regard to this aspect? I mean, 6 years later.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting point that you make. Individual women who express their anger are often dismissed as just being crazy. But there's something different when it is a collective anger that sparks a movement that they're, at least among a segment of the population, sees this as justified. And so as far as like the legacy, I can only answer that from my particular location as a woman living in the US, in New York City, who teaches in a university, because I have seen some concrete changes in those, in this place that I live in, some laws and policies that are starting to mitigate some of the violence against women. So for example, universities have changed their definition of sexual assaults and the policies that go along with that. So now that they all revolve around this idea of enthusiastic consent, in which unless there is an enthusiastic yes somewhere in a sexual encounter, not just the absence of a no, then that's how you define whether or not something is consent or not. And then in New York State, since the beginning of Me Too, there have been a few laws that have been passed that make it easier for survivors of sexual assault, as well as gender-based violence, to bring charges against their abusers. So, I don't know what the long-term consequence is going to be, but I think that these examples, these very concrete examples, signal a shift in the perspective that has arisen from women's demands. And, I think we're still in a very early stage of challenging patriarchal systems. But overall, I do think that the anger from the Me Too movement has been productive, and it has shown us a glimpse of possibility in collective anger, as opposed to the kind of anger that, can be isolated and just sort of dismissed and made invisible.
Yeah. And then also now, I do have the feeling that people listen more to those women's questions. I don't know whether that's, at least on Chinese social media, I noticed that as well. So we have formed, compared to 6 years ago, I would say there's significant change as well. When nowadays, when a woman starts out to question or to tell her stories of being abused or sexually harassed, the support from the society is significantly higher than before.
Oh, that's good. I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah. It's quite how to say, it boosts my confidence somehow.
Good.
And I think we probably moved to the last bit that I love the most. I like the most. It is just love and hope. I mean, when I said I cry a lot when I read your book, it's mostly in this part, like when I feel love and hope strongly. I mean, what impressed me is that we are from East Asian society. I never knew much about Korean culture, but I noticed the difference, how much between the Chinese and the Korean culture, how strongly Kunya and her sister's expression of love to each other. It's so out there, like it's so direct, and they're holding each other tightly and begging for the other not to leave, and that kind of expression really is moving. And also, of course, the part that you describe your recalling your mom gently lifting you out of bed, and when you were a kid, preparing breakfast for you every morning. And then later you return this to her. You cooked for her, showing your love. And this is such an important part of Asian culture, and maybe also universal culture.
Yeah.
And you cook Korean food she loved and longed for, and that allows her to, there are two things. One is that she could claim the legitimacy of enjoying Korean food, which in the beginning she was ashamed of, coming to the white society and wanting to mingle and eating pungent Korean kimchi is a shameful thing. But then she later claimed that. And then you also show her that that you by cooking for her, you are not going into a path that she's afraid of. She try to not let you go on, which is to go on the service-oriented
right
career path or whatever, right? So in the book, you discuss the political and social hierarchy embedded in food. But you also discuss about the love and hope that food brings. So how did it come to you that you use food as a central theme throughout this book? I mean, it's very effective and attractive as well as powerful.
One of the origins of the book is that after my mother died suddenly, all of these memories of her came back to me, and they were all memories of the first mother, from my childhood. And I noticed that in every memory there was food in the scene, so I know she was cooking, she was feeding someone, she was foraging, and I realized that there was so much of our lives that revolved around food that I had forgotten, because once she became what we call schizophrenic, I had forgotten. After a while, I had forgotten about that mother, also through my studies of this really dark history, and I wanted to bring that mother back. And so I realized the way to do it was to show her relationship to food and the way she kept our family together through her use of food, but also that it wasn't just that she used food for survival or for nurturing, but it was a form of currency for her. And I could see that in these memories. So in a world where she didn't have a lot of other resources, food was a really important one. And her skills around food in particular allowed her to sort of make friends in this community that for the most part saw her as an outsider. But I also realized it was sort of a gauge of her mental health, because once her interest in food declined, so did her mental health. And, it was at the point when she taught me how to cook Korean food and we shared those meals together, something started to heal. And it wasn't just a healing in her, but in me, because it was the first time she was able to talk about the past in a way that didn't send her to this place of trauma. It was sort of a place of love. And in that way, by teaching me how to cook Korean food, and it wasn't just any Korean food, it was the food that my grandmother used to cook for her, that I myself had never eaten until my mom taught me how to cook this food. She gave me this gift of my family history that I had been seeking for my whole adult life. And so it was, again, this wasn't really a conscious decision. It was just something that, appeared to me in these visions of my mom that I had during my grieving.
I see. I could resonate with that a lot, with this healing power and also inspiring power of food, given that we both come from Asian countries. So the last question, I think, would be like starting from your quote from Bell Hooks' book called Choosing the Margin as a Space of Radical Openness. I mean, there are two words that I find, there's three words, keywords that touches me particularly, radical, openness, and margin. Because as a feminist, and rather a radical one, I live exactly the same, I have exactly the same experience. And in the book you quoted, our living depends on our ability to conceptualize alternatives, often improvised. Marginality is also the site of radical possibility, a space of resistance. I mean, in the margin, I have also seen, in the margin of the society, I have also seen that there are lots of new possibilities to explore for women's future. And even though my attempts have been quite gentle, but they are considered to be radical, Um, I think perhaps this is because the love that drives the radicals is often passionate, and their hope for the future is more resolute. That distinguishes us from those who are hesitant and feel uncertain and hence unable to move further.
Yeah.
When did you find your space of resistance? At what age? And yeah, how would you describe your mission today?
Well, I think it probably the first time probably was in college when I had the opportunity to leave the small town that I grew up in. And I found a group of friends who were also misfits in a way, but I didn't have the conceptual tools at that time to understand the idea of the margins as a radical space. And it really wasn't until I was in graduate school and I encountered Bell Hook's ideas, as well as her mentorship. She was my mentor for the first 3 years that I lived in New York City. And it really changed my perceptions of myself in the world. And, I could take the experience of being marginalized and see it through the lens of possibility. And, to feel passionately about not wanting to conform to a norm that was exclusionary or psychologically violent, because I think that normativity can be both of those things. And so, I started to reconceptualize my place in the margins. It wasn't just a place that others had put me in, but a place that I could choose to live and work in. And so it's interesting, you picked out 3 words, which were you actually didn't include the word choose, because for me that was a really important word, to choose that place in the margins.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I didn't choose. I think I was pushed to the margin.
Well, I mean, I think it begins that way. It certainly for me it began that way, but then I started to see that there was hope there as well if you can reclaim that space, right?
Absolutely,
yeah. And so, as far as my mission, my mission has always been to shine a light on the things that we don't want to look at because they're too ugly or too painful. But that's something that's necessary for a society to do so that it doesn't keep on reproducing the pain and ugliness.
Exactly.
And that's why I write and that's why I teach. But nowadays as a mother, I think a lot about my kids and the world that they're inheriting and how I want them to be in the world as well. And so I am not going to hide things from my children the way that my family did. And I want them to understand that we can look at those ugly things with compassion, even as we learn from them. But we also have to develop a capacity to look for beauty. So those are the skills that we can use, maybe, to make the world more beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, this is very moving. I'm very moved by your way of describing your mission, and I do believe the power of this. I mean, first it begins with courage, right? You have to have the courage to look into it, and then you need love as well.
Yeah.
And the eye for beauty and understanding. So this is and I mean, did you have any role model through this process that you would like to share with our listeners?
Well, I mean, I think that there are the people that we've already talked about during the interview. My mom, my teachers, Bell Hooks and Patricia Clough. I mean, they all taught me how to do that in a way. And I think that one thing I wanted to mention about having courage, I never really think of myself as courageous. A lot of people,
you are. Come on.
A lot of people say that to me, but but I think so much of it is really just a need to do those things. And I think not everybody can look at the pain and the ugliness because they're too close to it, And so I think because I am my mother's daughter, and I'm a generation removed from what she experienced, I'm in a position that allows me to look at it without getting too close, because I almost sort of think about these, these historical traumas and atrocities almost as a psychological black hole, because if you're too close to it, you just get sucked in. So in this sense. And I think also in thinking about how atrocities come to the surface, it rarely, the story, the true story never comes out right afterwards, right? It takes a generation or two or three maybe for us to go back and look.
If they are not forgotten, Thank you so much. This is very, very, very inspiring talk with you, and I hope there could be more of your book translated into Chinese.
Yes, I hope so too. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for the feminist work that you're doing with this podcast.
Thank you, and hope we can have the chance to meet again one day in the US.
Yes, sounds good.